Hello, everybody. Welcome to the National Constitution Center and happy Constitution Day. It has been an amazing morning, and I'm so glad you could share it with us. Many of you saw the launch of our amazing new online platform, the Interactive Constitution. It's this incredible tool that I want all of you to go back to your classrooms and learn from. You can click on any part of the Constitution and hear the best minds in America exploring areas of agreement and disagreement. You can see videos and blogs and podcasts exploring early drafts of the Constitution. And then you can sign up online to talk to other classrooms in different parts of the country about the Constitution for conversations moderated by judges or master teachers. It is such a thrilling platform, constitutioncenter.org. Interactive Constitution. I want all of you to use it and tell me what you think. Friends, we are so honored and fortunate today to be able to talk with a Justice of the Supreme Court and the new honorary chair of the National Constitution Center, Justice Neil Gorsuch. All of us at the Constitution Center were so thrilled when Justice Gorsuch agreed to be our honorary chair, and I'm going to ask him in a moment why he agreed to take on this job, but he told me that it's because he really thinks that civics and civility, talking with people like you and educating you and inspiring you to educate yourselves about the essence of the Constitution is the most important thing that will guarantee the future of the country today. So that's why he's here. He's taken the time out of his incredibly busy schedule to spend Constitution Day with us. And Justice Gorsuch, I think I'll just begin with that question. Why did you choose to lead the National Constitution Center, and why are civics and civility important?
Well, Jeff, I'm honored to be here and honored to be of help to you in any way I can. I've known Jeff for a long time, since we were law clerks together, right out of school. That's how long I've known Mr. Rosen. And I think the work he's doing here is great. I think this is one of the most wonderful places in the country to learn about your country. And so I'm honored to be a part of it. And I think it's really important because civics sounds really boring, doesn't it? And sometimes they don't even teach it anymore. But what are the first three words in our Constitution? Excellent. We the people, right? And how can we the people run the government if we don't know much about it? I read the other day that only about a third of Americans can name the three branches of government, which I know everyone in this room can name. Isn't that incredible? Another third can only name one branch of government. And 10% think Judith Sheindlin serves on the United States Supreme Court. Now, those of you who are chuckling know who I'm talking about. That's Judge Judy. Now, I like Judge Judy, but she's not one of my colleagues. At the same time, 75% of Americans can name the Three Stooges. So we have some work to do, don't we? Right? Somebody has to run the place. And soon enough, much sooner than you think, it's likely to be some of you. So read the instruction manual, the owner's manual. That's what the Constitution is. It's your owner's manual for your government. And I know you don't believe me when I say I'm going to see some of you in court as judges, as lawyers, as justices. But let me tell you, I never thought I was going to be sitting here talking to you. And it happens in a blink of an eye. So prepare, study hard, and I'm glad to be here to chat with you.
You're so right about the fact that it happens in a blink of an eye. You and I did meet when we were law clerks, and it was a long time.
And neither of us had gray hair.
No, we didn't. We were much less gray, but it seems like it was
You're doing better than I am.
No, not much at all. Your biking is better, I hear. But what the justice says is right. 30 years go by like this. Neither of us would have ever thought that we'd be sitting here today. I have this incredible institution and the justice on the Supreme Court. It just happens when you follow your passion, when you take the time to really dig in deep about something that you care about and love. And now we have the benefit of talking to a Supreme Court justice. So we got to talk about the Constitution, but I know that all of our friends just want to know You said you didn't set out to be a justice, but now you are one. What's it like to be a justice of the Supreme Court? And what do you guys do for fun? How do you interact? Help us understand what it feels like to be a Supreme Court justice.
It is a very strange life. I used to be pretty anonymous. I lived in Colorado, in the countryside. And I think the day I was nominated, more pictures were taken of me in 1 hour than in the entire rest of my life. And I lost my anonymity completely. There'd be people at restaurants who'd be videoing me slurping noodles. I'm not always perfect with my noodles. And it's pretty embarrassing. But I have to tell you one thing that I've found in return. When God takes something away, he sometimes gives you something in return if you just look hard enough. And the thing I've gotten in return is the opportunity to meet so many people like you across the country who love this country, who love our Constitution, who want to improve our country and our Constitution, and who are committed to it. And that's been a real joy for me, a real joy. So, but it's still a pretty normal place, the Supreme Court. It isn't all dour and old people sitting around talking, though we do have old people sitting around talking an awful lot. 9 old people in Washington. We have some fun, too. So I'll share a couple of stories. How about that? Things you don't think that happen at the Supreme Court of the United States. Justice Sotomayor, one of my good friends, she's a huge Yankees fan. No. Come on, you guys, this is Philly, right? You can't cheer for the Yankees here. I'm a Rockies fan. I know, it's tough being a Rockies fan. So one time, the Yankees had done particularly well. And she showed up at conference before we go out to sit on the bench. And we're all putting on our robes. And she comes in wearing a robe with pinstripes and the Yankee logo on her breast. And I thought some of my colleagues were about to have a heart attack. And we all get lined up to go on the bench. And one of them asks, Sonia, you really going to wear that out in the Supreme Court of the United States? She responded, nah, I was just waiting for one of you to ask. So that's kind of what we do. We have lunch together all the time. Justice Breyer knows more knock-knock jokes than any human being should, and they're all terrible. When Justice Kavanaugh arrived, I had the obligation to hold him a welcome dinner. When a new justice arrives, there's always a welcome dinner, and the newest justice has to hold the welcome dinner for that person. When I arrived, Justice Kagan held a wonderful meal for me. She knew my wife liked Indian food, spicy stuff. So she got a friend of hers who's an Indian cook come in and cook this magnificent meal for us. It was great. Well, Justice Kavanaugh likes meat and potatoes. Boring food. So I had to come up with something else, right? So I figured entertainment. So after dinner, I told everybody, okay, let's leave the dining room and let's go down to the Great Hall of the United States Supreme Court. There's marble and busts of old judges. It's huge. It's long. It's echoey. It's a very fancy place. And when we arrived there, I handed the Chief Justice a checkered flag. Justice Kavanaugh is a huge fan of the Washington Nationals, and their mascots are the 4 presidents, giant foam-headed presidents. I mean, they're like 12 feet tall, Washington and Jefferson. And it turns out, and they run around at the baseball field, and it turns out if you go online, you can rent them. So we had a race in the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Chief Justice had the checkered flag, and he called the race. Now, I wasn't sure how that one was going to go over, so I figured that was one that was better to ask for forgiveness than for permission. So we have a little bit of fun along the way, too. It's just
won?
people.
Who won?
Well, Washington, of course.
Excellent, good.
Father of the country, right?
Phenomenal. people also want to know how you can get along given the fact that you sometimes so strongly disagree. And you've often stressed that it's not always the usual suspects, one camp against another. You often align in unexpected ways.
Yeah, I think people, sometimes we lose the forest for the trees, Jeff, about the rule of law in this country and the independent judiciary that we are so blessed to have. Now, is America perfect? No. I'm not here to tell you that. It took a civil war to correct one grave injustice in our Constitution. And it took an amendment to allow women the right to vote to correct another. And we've had 27 amendments in all. And all of them are vital and important. I think one of them, I want to talk about Gregory Watson. Remind me about that. Gregory Watson, all right, with you guys. But of course we disagree. You bring us the 70 hardest cases in the whole country every year, all right? It's true. But the rule of law in the country isn't just about 70 cases. In fact, it turns out we file about 50 million lawsuits against one another every year in this country. America's a pretty litigious bunch, right? And I'm not counting, you're too young, most of you, but I'm not counting your parking tickets or your speeding tickets. That's a whole nother 50 million, all right? Yeah, that's a lot, isn't it? It is a lot. You're probably responsible for some of them. So out of those 50 million, 95% or more are resolved by the trial court and never appealed, because most people want to be heard, but they accept the judgment of the judge and the jury as reasonable and just. Only about 5% get appealed, and those are almost always resolved unanimously by the lower courts. Out of that 50 million, only 70 cases come to the Supreme Court of the United States. That's it. They're the hard ones where the lower courts have disagreed. And we manage with 9 judges appointed from across the country, though maybe too many of them from New York, some say. I'm from a little further west. We manage with 9 judges from across the country appointed over 25 years by 5 different presidents to reach unanimous agreement 40% of the time. Now, I think that's pretty incredible. Are you guys able to get 9 people to agree on where to go to lunch? Right. You bring the 70 hardest cases in the country every year, and you get 9 people to agree unanimously 40% of the time? That's incredible. What about our 5-4 decisions? That's about 25 to 35% of our docket, the close ones. And last year there were 10 different combinations of justices in those 5-4 decisions. That's the rule of law in this country. And it's not perfect, but it is the envy of much of the world, and something that I'm very proud of. I think it's an incredible blessing of liberty we've received from our forefathers. It's a great privilege to help carry it on for one more generation before I pass off the baton to one of you.
You said you wanted to talk about a case called Greg v. Watson. Tell us about Greg v. Watson.
All right. This shows you that this is your republic, and you can be more a part of it than you think. There's a young man named Gregory Watson. Anyone heard of him? A couple of nodding heads, but not many. All right. Gregory Watson was in college, and he had to write a paper about the Constitution. And he was bored by the idea. Now, some of you may have been in those shoes, I imagine. So he wanted to see what he could do that would be unusual. And he went rooting around looking at the amendments to the Constitution. And he saw that James Madison had proposed some other amendments besides the first 10 to the Bill of Rights that didn't get fully ratified by the states. One of them had to do with the pay of congressmen, and said that before congressmen could raise their pay, there had to be an intervening election so that the American people could pass judgment on the wisdom of that pay raise. And it had been ratified by quite a number of the states back in the early part of the country, but not enough. So Gregory Watson wrote a paper saying, I think if just a few more states ratify this thing, it could become part of the Constitution too. It's not quite there, but why not continue? The teacher thought it was a crazy idea and gave him a C. Well, Gregory Watson didn't like that C. And so what he did is he started writing state legislators across the country and saying, I think you guys can ratify this thing. Just a few more states. And you know what? Some of those state legislators thought that was a pretty neat idea. And one, and then another, and then another, and then another. And then within just a few years, Gregory Watson got the 27th Amendment to the Constitution ratified in 1992. You can make a difference. And then, if you're smart, like Gregory Watson was, you go back to your teacher and you say, what about that C? And recently, just a few years ago, the teacher turned it into an A.
I'm so glad you told that amazing story of how one individual can actually lead to an amendment to the Constitution. And I was so thrilled to learn on the interactive Constitution that that amendment, which became the 27th Amendment, was the original Second Amendment. The Bill of Rights that was sent out to the states had not 10 amendments, but 12. The Justice knows all this, but you guys can see it online. The original First Amendment was not the one involving free speech. It said that there should be one representative in Congress for every 30,000 inhabitants. If that had passed, we'd have 4,000 Congress people today. And the original Second Amendment was the amendment the Justice just talked about, which forbade Congress from raising its salary without an intervening election, and that became the 27th Amendment. All of these, we've been talking about the Bill of Rights, but you argue in this wonderful new book that you have just written, and I'd love all of you to read it because you can learn so much about the Constitution from it. It's called A Republic If You Can Keep It. You make the point that the framers thought that the structural protections of the Constitution were as important, if not more important, than the Bill of Rights for protecting liberty. Tell us what you meant.
Well, first of all, I wrote the book with two young people, recent graduates from law school who clerked for me, two wonderful young people. One young man whose family are Mexican immigrants and Holocaust survivors on the two sides of his family. Saved up his pennies and managed to get into Harvard and graduated first in his class. Wow, after going to state college back in California. The other young lady, her family escaped communism, Czechoslovakia. So she's new to this country, immigrant. And she managed to graduate top of her class, and she worked with both Sonia Sotomayor and me before working on this book. So young people, not only just Gregory Watson, but two young people helped me write this book. Wonderful young people. The separation of powers. I'm sure you guys are studying it and think it's really boring, right? But at least you know what it is, right? Like, unlike most people who confuse it with the Three Stooges. So good for you. That's a start. Why does it matter? I thought it was kind of dry and dusty stuff when I was a kid. But as a judge, I've come to see how it affects real people when we muddle it up. James Madison knew that the real protection to your liberty isn't just a Bill of Rights. That's just a list of promises, right? Structures. You got to enforce those promises. You divide power. What am I? I'm 1/9 of 1/3 of the federal government, which is 1/2 of the sovereign governments in this country. Divide power. Most countries have bills of rights. My favorite is North Korea's. It's excellent. It's a really good Bill of Rights. It promises everything our Bill of Rights promises and more. It promises you a right to a free education, health care, and a right to relaxation, which sounds pretty good right after school started, hasn't it? Yeah. So what keeps us free isn't necessarily just the Bill of Rights, but the separation of powers. In North Korea, all power resides in one person's hands. Here we divide and conquer power. So what happens when you mix up these powers? Well, what if judges, instead of just applying the law fairly, start making things up and acting like legislators? That's pretty dangerous. Let me give you an example. Have you guys heard of the case called Dred Scott? It's one of the darkest moments in Supreme Court history. There, the Supreme Court, ignoring the Constitution, made stuff up and said that white people have a right to own black people as slaves in the territories of the United States. And they said that came from the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause. Now, I looked there, I don't see anything like that in there. They made it up. Now, they thought they were doing a good thing at the time, some of them. They thought they were helping avert a civil war. Of course, Judges make rotten politicians. And not only do they not avert the Civil War, they help contribute to it. Judges shouldn't act like politicians. What happens when, instead of making laws in Congress, we let the executive branch do it? You lose your right to have your representatives participate in a very public process. And instead, you have one person making the laws for you, the president. Do you want a king? I don't. Let me give you some examples of what happens there. I asked my law clerks the other day, how many federal criminal laws are there? And they told me there are about 4,500 federal criminal laws. I said, no, but Congress has allowed the executive branch to make up new criminal laws. I want you to count those too. How many of those are there? And they came back and they told me that they don't know. That the executive branch has made up so many new criminal laws that people have stopped counting at over 300,000. Turns out, you better not misuse something called the Bostwick consistometer, which measures the flow of ketchup. If your ketchup is too runny, you get in trouble for that because of a federal agency said so. I'm not making it up. What if you sell mattresses and you tear off that tag? You're probably a federal criminal. And if you import lobster in a plastic bag instead of a cardboard box, that's a problem because a bureaucrat says so. And Woodsy the Owl? Some of you, Woodsy the Owl, don't give a hoot, don't pollute. Remember him? Some of you remember him. Well, if you misuse his likeness, you might be a federal felon. Okay, that's what happens when you mix up the executive and the legislative power. And last one, and then I'll shut up. What happens when you mix up the judicial power with the executive power? And instead of getting an independent judge and jury to decide your case, somebody who doesn't have to answer to anyone but the law and can call them like he sees them, like she sees them, without fear or favor to anyone. And instead you have an executive branch official, someone who's responsive to politicians, deciding your case. I've had cases where immigrants to this country seeking lawful admission, or veterans seeking benefits for their service in Vietnam for post-traumatic stress disorder, have what looked like to me, as an independent judge, a winning argument. They should win under the law. But because of some doctrines we've invented, I have to defer instead to a bureaucrat who says they should lose. You've lost your right to an independent judge, and instead you get somebody who calls himself an administrative judge, pretends to be a judge, but really is a politician. Now, the separation of powers, that's why you should care. It protects your liberty. Bill of Rights is great, but I want an enforcement mechanism. And that's the separation of powers. And like the rest of the Constitution, it's up to you to keep it. It is we the people. And tyranny, as Ronald Reagan said, is only about one generation away.
Powerful stuff. There was a lot in there, and I want you all to listen closely and think about what the justice just said. He said the Constitution formally separates powers and says each of the branches can't exercise the powers of the other, and then he gave examples where, in fact, they are being blended and exercised, and told you why he thinks that that is a problem. You also mentioned the infamous Dred Scott decision. And after we talk, I hope later this afternoon, if you have time, you'll come with me just next door to see Dred Scott's original freedom petition, which is in that Civil War gallery. And friends, if you have time, I know you've been here for a long time and haven't seen the Civil War gallery, please go and be inspired by the incredible fight for freedom and equality after the Civil War, which led, as the Justice said, to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, ending slavery, extending equality to all persons, and extending to African Americans the right to vote. The promise of those amendments was undermined by the Supreme Court in some cases after they were passed, including those upholding segregation. A famous dissenter from those cases was Justice John Marshall Harlan, and in your book, you say that there's a portrait of Justice Harlan hanging in your chambers. Tell us why you have put it there.
I have two portraits hanging in my chambers. The first is of James Madison, because he's the father of the Constitution. He wrote it. He was 5'2". They called him Little Jemmy. And he wrote what I think is one of the most miraculous documents in human history. It is a great document. My job is to remain faithful to that. That's the oath I take. The other portrait is of John Marshall Harlan, who I think is kind of the father of the Reconstruction Amendments, the second Constitution, if you will, the one that corrected the great wrong of slavery, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution. I consider him the father of those amendments because he wrote a dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson that isn't perfect, but is one for the ages in a lot of ways. He is the only person on the Supreme Court of the United States who recognized that separate can never be equal. Can you believe that? 8 justices voted the other way. And you know what? It wasn't easy for him. He was from Kentucky. He came from a slave-holding background. But as a judge, he recognized what those words on the page mean. Equal protection of the laws. And he fearlessly abided by them. Now, I got to tell you, in his portrait, he looks pretty grumpy, pretty unhappy. And a lot of people were really angry with him at the time. And kind of a reminder for me that following the law isn't always popular, but it's my job. That's the oath I took. So those are the reasons why I have those two grumpy men looking down on me every day when I come to work.
Well, they're both inspirations, and you put it so powerfully, a second constitution created by those Reconstruction Amendments.
I think the Equal Protection Clause, the Equal Protection Guarantee, think about it, that every person, there's no one who's better or worse. We are all the same. Now, we know that, many from our faith, from our hearts, but to write that in law, I think that was one of the most radical, important pieces of law in our country's history, and maybe in all of human history.
What else is important about those amendments? We just had this morning a naturalization ceremony. And out of all the incredibly moving things that have happened today and happen here every day, there's almost nothing more moving than seeing newly naturalized citizens taking the oath and becoming U.S. citizens, 30 people from 42 countries. And that stems from the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, which says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. That was designed to overturn the Dred Scott decision, which said African Americans could not be citizens. Tell us more about that provision and why it's important.
Well, my wife is a naturalized citizen, so I care about this. I have a speech in the book that I give to naturalized citizens. And I think what they understand that maybe some of us don't or take for granted is how special this country is. It's not perfect. Right? Most countries in the world have a common culture, a shared history. Come from China, thousands of years of history. Europe, hundreds or thousands of years. And they're all the same, often the same race or culture or creed. America doesn't share any of that in common. And what the immigrants that I meet know is that we share something much more important and delicate in common. We share an idea in common. That we, the people, can govern ourselves. That we can do it wisely. That we are equal to one another. And that we all have certain unalienable rights. And that the government isn't here to tell us what to do. We're here to tell the government what to do.
Unalienable rights, such an important idea, so central to the framers. I learned on the Interactive Constitution that Madison took that idea, as Jefferson did, from George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, which says that all persons are born in a state of nature with certain rights from God or nature, not from government. And when they form governments, they can't surrender or alienate those rights. and government has a responsibility to ensure greater security and safety of the rights they've retained. How is that idea important to understanding American government?
I mean, that was a radical idea in history, and it still kind of is. Ours is the oldest written constitution in history. And it was really the first one where the people deliberated before a government was created. And they decided what the government would look like. And they did. They said that our rights don't come from a king, a crown, a prince, or a government, let alone a bureaucrat. They come from nature and God. They inhere in each and every one of us. It's our spark of life. And that is a radical thing in all of human history. I think it was Daniel Webster, who said something like, miracles don't cluster. And it took 6,000 years of human history and civilized history before something like that happened. And you better take care with it, because you can't be so sure it'll happen all that often.
Powerful warning, and Madison was so unconvinced that the miracle would happen again that he did not favor a second constitutional convention because he thought that the second time things might go wrong.
The other thing I think that they all counted on was, in a democracy, of course, it's going to be a little raucous, right? When you guarantee everybody the equal right to speak their minds and make sure they're pretty comfortable doing it, it's going to be pretty loud. There are going to be a few elbows thrown on the field of play. And that's okay. I mean, you all have seen or heard Hamilton, right? A lot of you. Right? I mean, we got a vice president and a secretary of treasury shooting each other there, right? I mean, at least we're not doing that anymore, huh? Senators used to cane one another, whack each other on the floor of the United States Senate. Well, I don't know if we've improved, but we at least don't do that anymore. One thing, though, I think it does depend upon, right? If you want your rights, you have to be willing to tolerate somebody else's. If you want to speak, you have to listen, don't you? And if you really believe in equality, then don't you have to treat the other person as you'd like to be treated? Right? For the whole thing to succeed, it should be a little raucous. But once in a while, we should remember that for a republic to work, we also have to be kind to one another. And a lot of different ways to put it, and you've heard it in many different ways before, but the one that sticks with me is my wife's grandmother. She'd seen a lot of life. And she said to me one time, you know, Neil, you're going to have a lot of regrets in life. I guarantee it. Can't help it. There are things you're going to say and do that you wish you hadn't. And there are going to be things you've left unsaid and undone that you wish you did. But the one thing in life you'll never regret is being kind. I think that's pretty important in this day and age, and I think you all need more courage to be kind, maybe, than I did. You live in an age of social media, where I know cyberbullying is an issue. And I read that 60-70% of kids don't want to get involved in public service because of the nature of our dialogue today. And what I want to say to you is, the words don't hurt that much, and the country needs people like you to be involved. And maybe you can be a force for kindness along the way, too.
Justice Gorsuch, for inspiring and educating all of us about the Constitution on Constitution Day, thank you so much.